Angry People in the Woods, submitted by Single Track Sean. So this happened back in 2010 in northern Pennsylvania. Anyone from that area knows that there's choice mountain biking, and back then I had more time to ride than I do now, so at least twice a week and once per weekend I was out there making every minute count. One place that I would frequent was state land that butted up against private plots and farms and such. The farmers were super cool to everyone that used the trails as long as they didn't trespass, and I've had more than one long conversation with them, making me forget why I was out there in the first place. However, out there, not everyone is so nice. My friend Taylor and I found that out one summer. This story takes place over 2 summer months of that year. Taylor was one of my best riding mates, and we teamed up a lot on relay races and such. One late afternoon, we were navigating some gnarly single-track stuff that looped between a steep climb and a fairly long downhill section. Fairly long equals about a mile. There were tons of rocks and roots and down trees for obstacles, so it's really technical, and you have to pay attention there. As we're rocking our way through things, we came across a guy and his girlfriend on the side of the trail, and she was obviously hurt. We stopped and asked if they needed anything and if they were okay, and she was, but she still was kind of in rough shape. The guy told us that someone rigged up something on the trail that caused his girlfriend to have an accident, and the first thing we thought was, well, this is pretty technical. Maybe this section is beyond her capabilities. Later, Taylor and I noticed the racing tag on her helmet that was for experts, so that ruled that out. The guy pointed to a log in the path meant to be a rideable obstacle, but on one side, someone had dug out about 2 feet down across the trail and put a thin layer of sticks and covered it with dirt and moss. Anyone bunny hopping the log would have sailed clear, but someone else just wheeling over it would have gone ass over handlebars, as their front wheel would have surely smashed through that crap and right into the hole. That's exactly what had happened to this woman. All 4 of us talked about who would do something this insane, and got to filling in the hole. The woman's front wheel was bent a little, but not tacoed, so the 2 slowly rode off, and we told them the goings were safe as we'd just come that way. Later, over a beer, Taylor and I talked about that incident. He looked at me and said, "Dude, you know that wasn't another biker that did that, right?" I agreed and thought about what kind of asshole would go out of their way to do something like that. I stopped thinking about it until my next ride out there when I went solo. I was more cautious than usual, and it kind of ruined the ride. After a bit, I got over my tenseness and got to one of my favorite downhill sections where I loved putting my butt over the back wheel and just really going for it. But for the already stated reason, I did hold back a little. Something still didn't feel right. About halfway down, I stopped completely, and my intuition was right on. You couldn't really see it in the dark of the woods. It was light out, but you know how it gets darker in the forest. But there was something there. Right at about what was chin or neck level on me was a piece of braided fishing line tied taut between 2 trees. It was right after a really sharp turn, and anyone with speed and my size would never have had time to stop. I looked around and shook my head. Another frickin' trap. I took out my multi-tool and cut that shit down and went on my way, even more wary. For the next 2 weeks, I didn't go back there. One night, I was on a local MTB forum and saw someone had started a topic about what was going on out there. Me and Taylor weren't the only ones who had encountered stuff. There were at least 5 other people who had found similar traps all around the trails, but mostly in one section. I started to notice that most of them were on parts that ran alongside private land. I thought about it and realized that I never really saw any farmers or anyone else for that matter out there. As I mentioned, other sections of the trail had people that would chat us up. But in that section, I never saw a soul. Everyone agreed to let everyone else on the forum know what they had found and where, and to take pictures if they could. We were going to take everything to the police and park rangers. After a few days, nothing was noticed, but then suddenly things started to get worse. More traps were noticed that were meant to take people down, but now some of them had tons of broken glass and shit in the dirt and grass. Some logs had been set up against deadfalls, so if someone were to ride over them, the movement would cause the dead trees to fall onto the path. Now it was getting serious. One day, Taylor and I were out there, and he had ridden ahead a little bit. And that's when I saw them. Two guys I'd never seen before were down a short hill, and they came out onto the trail. They had shovels and bags of who knows what, and after they looked around, they started digging a hole next to a puddle. Most mountain bikers know to ride through puddles, but noobs will often ride around the sides of a puddle because they don't want to get wet or don't want to gauge how deep the puddle is. This was a trap obviously set for them. They didn't see me as I had stopped to the side of some trees at the top of the hill when I had noticed them. I watched them for a little bit, and then I heard Taylor yell out, "Yo, Sean, you riding or you hiding?" He must have turned around looking for me. The two guys heard him too, and they looked up and after a minute grabbed their shit and ran back into the woods. I rode down the hill to where they were and saw the little hole they were working on. Taylor rode up and asked what the hell I was doing, and I told him, and we both scanned the woods, seeing nothing. Then we heard a shotgun blast not too far away, and we immediately got out of there. We reported everything to the police, but my description was pretty lame. I vowed I was not going back there, but Taylor said maybe they'd lay off if they thought we'd seen them. And I thought it was over. 2 days later, a guy I raced with once in a while got hurt really bad after a fall on a downhill section after someone shot him with fireworks. I don't know what it was, but I heard he said it was like a bunch of shit exploded right in his face and it shot him off the trail, and he cracked into a tree. Fucked his back up and his new stump jumper. Now the police were starting to look into things. After they patrolled out there with some guys on quads, things died down again and there were no more traps. Taylor convinced me it was cool to go again, and I did. And this time we went with a third friend, Mindy. She was and still is a beast on 2 wheels, although she's a roadie now. Anyway, we were out having a great time and decided to stop for a break. We were in the questionable section, but none of us were uneasy. We were just chatting and getting ready for the push back out. Then, Mindy stopped talking mid-sentence and stared over our shoulders. On the trail were 2 men wearing what looked like demon Halloween masks. They were literally maybe 20 feet away, and one was holding up a dead rabbit in one hand and a knife in the other. As we stood there looking at him in disbelief, the guy began stabbing the rabbit and then pointed the knife at us. I heard a noise behind us, and I turned to see 2 more guys with masks on, and one was holding a shotgun. None of us said a word until I whispered, "What the fuck are we gonna do now?" Mindy finally yelled out, "Look, we don't want any trouble. Let us ride out of here and we won't come back, okay?" I was thinking, yeah, they're really gonna go for that. A maniac who is stabbing an animal and pointing a knife at us with his 3 fucked up friends, and they're just gonna let us leave, right? What seemed like 5 minutes passed with these guys just staring at us. And Mindy yelled out again, "Okay, we're leaving." Then, as quietly as they showed up, all 4 of them went back into the woods without saying a word. "Well, what do you think?" I said quietly. "Let's just go," said Taylor, and he got on his bike. We all started pedaling away, all eyes on the part of the trail where they had just stood. It was Mindy, Taylor, then me. Right after we passed the exact spot where they were, something came flying out of the trees, and it was the guts of the rabbit, and they splattered on Mindy and Taylor. How they missed me, I don't know. We jammed it into overdrive and really rocked the shit out of there. Had we been in a race, we'd all have placed first, second, and third. We got back to our vehicles and called the cops, and they came out and took one look at the gore on Mindy and Taylor, and then called for people to head out into the woods on ATVs again. They never found anything, and as far as I know, that was the last anyone saw of those guys, and there were no more traps either. I stayed away from that place for a couple of years, but I have been back. It's still great riding and it's safe, but every time I get to that place where we stopped and saw those guys, I half expect to see them again in those demon masks. And let me tell you, I don't stop. I always haul ass right through. The Legend of Blue Dark by Billy P. It was the summer before 8th grade, and I was going to have a campout. I was really excited because I was going to have all my friends over, and we were going to do one of my favorite things, and that was to camp out. My best friend, who I will call Jerry, had gotten there early to help me set up camp and the tent and everything else. Everyone else started getting there around 7 o'clock. We all went inside to eat and then decided what to do for the rest of the night. I knew I wanted to go in the woods and play war games, and after we ate it, we decided to watch a little TV, and then we got bored of that, so we decided to go into the woods eventually. Obviously, you can't have a good campout unless you have a good ghost story. Well, the ghost story I was going to tell them was true as far as I knew, and here's the story I told them. 3 years ago, I was in my bed, and it was storming outside. I can't sleep well in thunderstorms, so I was just lying there wide awake when all of a sudden I heard a loud crash. I got up out of my bed and rushed to the window to see what had happened. Outside, I saw an 18-wheeler lying on its side in a ditch about 200 yards from my house. About 15 minutes later, the police arrived and got everything underway as far as their investigation. The weird thing was that the truck had crashed right by an old cemetery up the road. I went back to bed and finally fell asleep. The next morning, I heard my mom and dad talking about what the paper had to say about the crash. They said that the police said the 18-wheeler truck was carrying some sort of toxic chemical to a dump site somewhere, and that the driver had lost control and ran into the ditch and then turned on its side. Here's the weird thing. The police never mentioned the condition of the driver. But my sister's boyfriend had an uncle on the police force, and he said they never found a body. The doors of the truck cab had been jammed open, and the chemical had somehow leaked over into it, and apparently that ate the man's body up. My neighbor says every now and then he stands on his back porch and can see the figure of a glowing something running along the edge of the woods. That was the end of my story. But truth is, that really did happen. However, I didn't really believe the part about the man's body being eaten up by chemicals. I was just telling my friends that's what I heard. My neighbor does say he sees a figure every now and then, and the police supposedly never did find the driver's body. I don't know if that's true. I mean, if it was a ghost, because I don't believe in ghosts. After I told my friends the story, we were pretty deep in the woods, just walking along and talking, and I told everyone to turn their flashlights off and just walk in the dark. It wasn't dark enough for us not to see where we were going because it was a perfectly clear night. But after a few minutes, we turned the lights back on, and right when we did, Jerry said, "Billy, what is that?" I turned and froze dead in my tracks. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Finally, after a couple of seconds and what seemed like an eternity, I said, "That's him, y'all." There, standing about 40 yards away, stood what seemed to be like a bright blue glow in the form of a human. My neighbor saw a green glow, but this was not green. It was like the color of the ocean off the coast of Florida. It was just a bright blue glow. What got me is when I shined the flashlight on it, it disappeared, so I moved the flashlight just to the right of it to take the light off of it again, and it reappeared. All of this took place within about 10 seconds. Then all of a sudden, it started moving towards us, and believe me, it was fast. We were so scared a car couldn't have caught us as we ran away. I mean, we were moving faster than I ever thought we could. As we were running, I heard it scream or roar or make some sound, and all I know is that was the most horrible sound I had ever heard. And that made us run all the more fast. We ran to my neighbor's house first, and my friend, who I'll call Danny, practically ripped the screen door off the hinges trying to get in the house. The funny thing is, Danny is about as big as a toothpick and has no strength whatsoever. At least he hadn't been strong up until that point. He didn't even know my neighbors, but he didn't care about nothing but getting away. He just ran into my neighbor's house and grabbed a hold of Miss Clara, who lived there, and hugged her as a little child grabs his mom after not seeing her for a whole day. We were all so scared we couldn't talk straight and tell my neighbors what we had seen. Finally, they took us back to my house, which was only about another 100 yards away. We were still shaken up and couldn't talk straight, and my mom was trying to get what happened out of us, but we just couldn't say anything right. Then my dad came in from the living room after hearing all the fuss. He kept trying to figure out what had happened, and it didn't take him long. And this is what made me realize everything was real. My dad looked me straight in the eye after about 5 minutes and said, "You saw him, didn't you?" I was shocked. My dad knew what had happened. He said, "I told you not to take them back there near the cemetery. I told you not to, but you did it anyway, didn't you?" I asked him, "Dad, how did you know?" And he said, "'Cause I've seen him too." He told me that he saw him once late at night coming home from the garden, and it chased after him, but he never told me that because he didn't want to frighten me. I knew then what I had seen was no joke. There was no prank someone had played on us, and I certainly wasn't playing a prank on my friends. What I had seen was a real live ghost, or should I say a real dead ghost. After a few hours, we just started referring to the ghost as Blue Dark, and from this day on, it's a well-known story to the people around my neighborhood. I've never been back to that spot, at least not at night anyway. I don't think I ever will either. I do know this. I don't blame anyone for not believing in ghosts, but I know what I saw, and it wasn't right. In case you're wondering, this story took place in Natchez, Mississippi. It was the scariest time of my life. The Old House, submitted by Tester's Choice. I grew up in a suburb of Atlanta. There were a lot of newish neighborhoods that had been built up over the years, but back in the 70s there wasn't as much as there is now. That's life, I guess. So when some developers were going to build one of these new housing developments, they were also going to knock down this old estate that was the so-called haunted house by all the kids in town. We would always sneak out there and scare each other with tales of ghosts and stuff we'd heard from other kids and our siblings. As far as I really know, it was just a huge old run-down house. When we heard that it was going to be torn down, we decided to go out to it one last time before it was gone forever. Of course, we had to go at night for maximum scare effect, right? There were 5 of our gang, me, Joe, Bill, Keith, and Emma, who was Keith's little sister, and quite a tomboy. We got flashlights and headed out, probably telling our parents we were going somewhere else. We knew they didn't want us out there, especially with the demolition coming up soon. It was about a 15-minute walk to get there, and when we did get there, we saw that a lot of the trees that were once around it had already been cut down. Far down a lane was the place, and it was just getting dark. The house was massive. I don't know how many bedrooms and other rooms, but there were at least 6 bedrooms. It was totally unsafe to be out there, but kids are kids no matter where you go. Joe was talking about all this ghost stuff, getting everyone else scared, and Emma was telling Keith that we shouldn't go inside. We were all laughing at her because we knew the stories weren't true. We got up to the house, and Joe and I tried the door. It was locked or jammed, so we couldn't get in that way, and Emma looked happier. But we really wanted to get in, so we moved around to the back of the house, and holy smokes, a huge portion of the back had already fallen down, like someone had just grabbed the whole wall and yanked it outward. It was still light enough for us to see, and we could make out that there was some furniture and stuff still inside. I started to walk over the rubble with the guys right behind me, and Emma still saying we should leave. I really wish we had listened to her. Once we got inside, it was a little darker, so we switched on our lights and began exploring. Bill and Joe decided to head upstairs, and they said that they could feel the steps sagging beneath their weight, but it was holding up. I was checking out a front parlor with Keith and Emma, and that's when we heard the noise. It sounded like a person coughing, but it was coming from down the hall somewhere. I went over to check it out. Maybe there was someone else out there that was doing the same thing we were. But there was no one. I could hear the guys moving around slowly upstairs, so I knew it wasn't them. And then it came again. This time behind us, opposite of where we first heard it. I looked at Keith, and he said, "What was that?" I shook my head and then yelled out, "Hey, who's there?" No answer. It was weird. I walked down the hall to see if someone else was over there, but nobody was, or so I thought. While I was telling Keith no one was there, a closet door creaked open, and two men in their 20s, I guessed, came shambling out with these weird grins on their faces. It's been decades since this happened, but I'll always remember how they looked. They were creepy and wearing stained clothes and had dirt on their faces and arms and hands. Without saying a word, they walked towards us, and one pointed at Emma, and they both kept grinning creepily. I turned, ran into Keith, who then bumped into Emma, and she fell down. I tried to run and grabbed her by the arm and started pulling her along with me, and she let out a scream. More of pain than fright, I'm guessing. Keith grabbed her other arm, and we got her on her feet, and she screamed again. Now, I can't be sure, but I'm almost positive one of the guys said, "I don't like it when they scream." Keith doesn't remember that to this day, but I'm pretty sure that's what I heard. We ran out of the room and down the hall to the way out, and Keith yelled for the other guys to get out of the house. Someone else was in there. Emma was crying and wailing at this point, and I'm just trying to get her to move faster. Bill shouts back, "What? What's going on?" And I just yelled, "Get out!" I heard thudding upstairs as we scrambled over the rubble and back into the grassy yard, and I looked back to see Bill running after us. We ran to the edge of the trees, and then curiosity got at us as we looked back to see if the men were chasing us. That's when we realized Joe was not with us. "Bill, where's Joe?" I asked. Bill said he thought he was right behind him, but of course he wasn't. Emma was still crying, and I told Keith to take her home and get some help. Bill and I'd go back and look for Joe. He nodded and started running off with his sister right behind him, trying to keep up. Bill and I talked about a plan to go back in the house to get Joe, even though we were scared and didn't know where he was. We scrambled back over the rubble and went inside, and we tiptoed through the rooms until we heard voices talking low, and something that sounded like paper being crumbled up. We heard steps coming our way, so we ducked into a front room, and we noticed the two men walking by, talking quietly. Again, we couldn't make out what they were saying. All was quiet again after a bit, except for the crumpling sound. I peeked down the hall to the room where we had seen the men and moved towards it. The sound got louder, and both of us went into the room, and we saw legs sticking out of the closet. It was Joe. His feet and hands were tied, and there was a rag in his mouth, and he was crying, and man, I couldn't blame him. We were all scared. While Keith stayed in the doorway keeping an eye out for the men, I untied Joe, and we heard the voices again. This time they were outside, and when we looked through the dirty windows, we could see the men in the backyard looking at the trees, and I'm sure they were looking for us. We decided that we'd try to open a front window and go out that way and avoid the men, and that's exactly what we did. There was a short drop into some bushes, and we got cut up pretty good, but we started running from home like you wouldn't believe. Halfway there, we slowed down and asked Joe what had happened, and he said when he came down from the upstairs, one of the guys grabbed him, and they tied him up and put him in the closet. They didn't say a thing, and he had no idea what they were planning. When we got back to Keith's house, He had told his mom and dad what had happened, and his dad was on the phone with the police. They went out to the house, but there was no sign of the men other than a bunch of empty cans of food and dirty clothes. The men were nowhere to be found. We all got in trouble for going out there, and I sure got hided by my dad that night. But we all survived and now have a scary story to tell. The house was finally knocked down, the development went up, and we never saw those men again. Theater Ghost by Anonymous. I had just been in a show at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which closed on a Sunday. The show, not the university. I'm allergic to hairspray, so I can't change in the dressing rooms in the basement of the theater. And since the theater is located in the music building, I ran up to a practice room on the second floor to change costumes and makeup. After Friday night's show, I was talking to some friends who had come to see it, and I guess I took longer than usual to change and take off my makeup, because by the time I had brought my costumes back down to drop them off at the dressing room, the theater was dark and locked, and everyone had left. I was bummed because I was standing there with my bike and an armful of costumes that I couldn't very well take home with me on my bike. I locked up my bike and began systematically trying doors all around the theater to see if one was open and I could at least leave the costumes inside the theater tucked away somewhere until the next day's performance. Every door I tried, though, was locked. Stage entrance, main doors, shop room. So in desperation, I took the stairwell down to the basement. There are professors' offices and more practice rooms in the basement, and at the end of a corridor is a door, more often than not locked, which leads to another corridor which goes to the dressing rooms. Surprisingly, this door was open, and I was relieved because I figured this meant that someone was still there and I would be able to lock up my costumes. I went through and down the corridor to the dressing rooms, but as I approached them, I could see that all the doors were locked and most of the lights were off. Out of desperation, I decided to go to the women's dressing room door and try it anyway because I had to leave the costumes somewhere. As I moved down the hallway and turned to open the door, I stopped dead in my tracks about 3 feet from it. I felt an unmistakable sudden chill, and the hair on the back of my neck rose up, which is a very bizarre sensation for those of you who have never felt it. I got the distinct feeling that there was someone standing behind me. Moreover, I got the feeling that it was male and older, not the age of someone in the cast or a student. But there are people working with the show who are older, including orchestra members, so I figured it was one of them. I turned, and there was no one there. But I felt they were still there, and I felt that they were watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling once I didn't see anyone standing there, and I called out, "Who is that?" still hoping that maybe it was someone who'd unlocked the dressing room door for me. When no one responded, I decided to go to the other entrance of the women's dressing room around the corner, not realizing I still hadn't checked the door I was standing by. I took 2 steps down the corridor and stopped again. The pit of my stomach had just fallen out, like when you're in an elevator that drops too quickly. I got the abrupt feeling that it would be a very bad idea to go down that corridor, and that whatever I was feeling was watching me and had been previously neutral, now suddenly felt threatening. I got the impression of a very large presence looming over me, and that I should get out now. Did I? You betcha. I turned right around and headed back the way I'd come, trying futilely to hum tunes from the show, but breaking into a run before I even made it to the door that led back to the professor's offices and practice rooms. As soon as I made it through and rounded the corner, all of the feelings suddenly vanished, like they'd never even happened. Needless to say, I was spooked badly. I rolled up the costumes in a huge ball and somehow made it home with them on my bike. I told 2 other cast members about it, but no one else, and I've never heard of anything like that happening in the theater. I will never, ever go down to the basement by myself ever again, not for $1 bazillion. And for what it's worth, I've been in lots of performances in that theater and have been in the basement lots of times by myself. before, but I won't ever go again. I felt like whatever or whoever was down there had business down there that I had unwittingly intruded upon, and the consequences if I had stayed would have been very unpleasant. Man, I had trouble sleeping for the next couple of nights, and I was so badly spooked that one of the other cast members I had told came to check on me after the next show. I didn't like being in the basement even with all the other people around, although I didn't feel anything amiss ever again. Chased, submitted by Giddy Kitty. A long time ago, when most people hearing this were probably not even born, I was driving from Chicago to visit my friend at Southern Illinois University. It was a straight shot for the most part, but my friend I was visiting, I'll call her Christy, asked me to stop at her grandmother's house off the beaten path in the middle of nowhere, a place called Iola. She wanted some papers from her family that were going to be part of some project she was working on at school. Hey, no big deal to me. I'd get off Route 57 and fly over there and then get back on the interstate. I left early in the afternoon so I could get to Carbondale in time for dinner and then be able to go out dancing. Following my written down instructions, no cell phones or GPS, kids, we just had maps and such, I got to an exit that would take me to Iola and Christy's grandparents' house. I found that easy too, and her sweet grandmother made me stay and chat for a bit and have something to eat. I really wanted to get back on the road, but how do you say no to a little old lady who lives way out in the country? Like so many stories on this channel, here my troubles began. Her grandfather, a well-intentioned soul, gave me different directions to head south and get on Route 57 at a different exit. Apparently there was construction on the way I was going, and this back route would be faster. Being a 20-year-old idiot, I agreed, thinking of the prospects of my friend and hot guys at the college. The sun was going down as I started driving down country roads, and I was just playing my tapes on the car stereo, hoping this would get me to Christie's faster. Not long after I left, I saw I needed gas, so I stopped in another little nowhere town called Xenia. Basically, there was a gas station there and not much else. I filled up on gas and tried the payphone to call Christy to let her know where I was and I was going to be probably late, but it was out of order. I noticed out of the corner of my eye a guy in a pickup truck talking to another guy in a car. They were really giving me the once-over. Armed with some chips and Pepsi, I got back on my little horizon and looked at the directions again. I was to stay south until I got to another interstate, get on that, and then head west to 57. No problem. I jogged through Xenia town proper, and this place looked like a freaky movie out of the 70s with this strip of building storefronts and nothing else. And soon I was back out in the boonies. It was dark when the lights went on behind me, and I saw what looked like a cop, but now I realized it wasn't cop lights at all. But I wasn't too sure, so I pulled over and the guy in the car got out and came over to my window. It was the guy from the gas station, and he had this blue shirt on with some emblems, but it didn't look like a real uniform. But again, I'm out in the middle of nowhere and don't know what I'm dealing with. He asked for my license and all that stuff, and asked me if I knew why I was being pulled over. Not really knowing, I said as much, and he walked back to his car. I was pissed that I was being waylaid and knowing that I hadn't done anything wrong. He came back and asked me to step out of the car, and being young and dumb and not knowing I didn't have to do this, I got out. The guy said something about me having a nice body and handed my stuff back, but as I reached for it, he pulled it away playfully, at least that was playfully in his head, and he asked if I was interested in going on a date that night. I was taken aback, but I was also smart enough to know not to cause trouble. I said I was flattered, but I had plans and really needed to get going. He just stared at me for a long time and gave me my license and just turned and walked away. I got back in my car and pulled away thinking the whole thing was really weird. I kept going, but couldn't help notice that the car behind me started following me again. Then again, it was a straight shot with just a couple of turns. probably going the same way I was. But it became evident something was up when a pickup truck came roaring up and passed both of us and then swerved in front of me. I flipped the driver off for scaring me and yelled a little bit, but I let it go. I was more worried about the guy behind me. Then all of a sudden, the truck started slowing down, and the guy behind me flipped on his brights. It was then that I knew something was very wrong. The high beams went off, and the truck got a little faster, but after a few minutes, the car behind me started flicking the beams on and off, and I was really starting to lose it at this point. I'm out in the middle of fucking nowhere, and these two guys are messing with me, and I'm a tough woman, but I was really scared at that point. I saw a sign that 15 was coming up, and I remember that I think 15 can take me to another town before the interstate Christy's grandfather told me to take. We came to an intersection where the right-hand turn is supposed to happen, and the truck just stopped in front of me and didn't move. The car behind me got up so close I couldn't even see his lights. We all just sat there. I burst into tears and screamed out, "What do you want?" before the truck turned in the opposite direction I was going. I gingerly moved up and made the right and floored it. The car behind me didn't follow, and I was still in tears and sobbing as I drove along quickly. But less than a mile later, I saw lights behind me coming up fast, and the same thing happened again. Again, I was boxed in, now screaming with tears rolling down my face. I didn't know what to do, but I saw signs that a town called Mount Vernon was coming up, and that was the biggest town before I could get back on 5764. More cars started popping up, and we got into town, and I started to feel a little bit better, but was still scared they might try something, and no one in this town would care. I saw a Hardee's coming up and thought I'd go in there and ask for help, and one good thing happened, and one bad thing happened. I got stuck in a drive-through lane, not realizing that's where I was. But the truck didn't realize what I was doing, so he kept going on straight. The car behind me got cut off by a guy also going into the drive-through, so he was still following, but now 2 cars behind. I got to the little order box and screamed that I needed the police, and someone had to help me. The poor girl working the drive-thru said she'd get a manager, and eventually I got to the window, and they said they had called the police and to pull into the parking lot to sort things out. A manager guy came rushing out and stood by my car, but the other car drove off and screeched into the street and drove away. The police came and I told them everything, and they took a report, but there wasn't anything else they could do other than keep an eye out for the truck and car based on my description. When I told them about the police officer I didn't think was a cop, they took it seriously, but again, there was still little they could do. One of them asked me if I wanted to stay in town for the night, but I said I really needed to just get out of there. So they followed me to the interstate and got on with me for about 15 miles, making sure that I wasn't being followed. One pulled up alongside me and gave me a "you okay" look, and I nodded and gave a thumbs up. They both got off at an exit, and I sped the rest of the way to Carbondale. I have no idea what those guys were trying to do other than scare me, but they really got to my core. Once I got to Christie's, I melted down all over again, still so scared. Nothing else happened, and I did enjoy my weekend there and hooked up with what I thought was a hunk at the time. Hey, girls need love too. And Christy spent a ton of time apologizing for sending me out to her grandparents. So, all ended well, but even today, this many years later, every time I see someone flick on their high beams behind me, I freak out a little bit. I don't think that trip will ever leave my mind. Escorted from the Woods by Anonymous. It was a few weeks after Christmas, and I was out taking pictures for some new projects. I was off-road about 15 miles with 12 to 14 inches of snow on the logging roads. I had driven these roads many times throughout the seasons, and my truck was more than able to get me through the drifts. It was about 2 in the afternoon when I entered the forest to one of my favorite places to shoot, an old abandoned homestead. About 3 or 4 crumbling old log buildings are there and make interesting subject matter. I wanted to catch the right light, and there were some older snowmobile tracks under the week-old powder, but no other signs of people being around. It was about -10 and no wind, so a nice winter day for photography. The shadows were getting longer, so I got out of my truck and started to walk towards the edge of the clearing. I shot for about an hour and a half, when I got the feeling I wasn't alone anymore. I've seen coyotes, moose, deer, and the odd bear here and there, but the wind was blowing from behind me, so they would have smelled my scent and vanished. There was a rumored wolf pack around, but I think I would have heard them. The aspen stands are difficult to see into, and your eyes can play tricks on you, so I shrugged everything off to nerves and kept looking for that ultimate sunset shot. I looked towards my truck about 500 yards to the south of me. I had wandered pretty far, and I leave it open and keys in it out in the woods just in case I fall down or drop them in the snow. I figured I had enough pictures for the day and put my camera in my backpack and then started back towards the truck. This is where it gets strange. The snow was knee-deep and tough going. Again, I got the feeling I was being watched, and I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing was there. I kept going, following the tree line about 30 feet away along a frozen creek. And then I heard it. Some small twigs snapping in the woods about 150 yards away. This is thick bush with 1 or 2 feet of deadfall along with powder snow about 2 feet deep. Not an easy going for any creature. I picked up my pace to a fast trot. I didn't need to meet up with a bear who was yet to go to sleep for the winter. But now I started to hear actual footsteps, and it or they were running through the woods, either alongside my path or towards me. I didn't wait to find out. I ran for my truck, which was now about 100 yards from me, and the sun was nearly gone by now, which made it even more scary. I darted across the clearing, and I reached the truck with the trees snapping 200 feet away. There was a definite grunting now, like an elk, but much deeper. I got to my truck and jumped in, and as I fired it up, I started to turn it around. I saw the pine trees in front of me shaking, and the snow falling off in the last light of the day in my truck lights. I went back 2 weeks later, and in that area I found snapped-off 6-inch saplings, but that was about it, as it had snowed 2 or 3 feet over those weeks. This was at an elevation of about 4,200 feet. Later, I told a friend about this, and he said Bigfoot, and told me of an encounter on the same road which was far more dangerous the year prior. I have since moved away from BC. I have shot, camped, and ridden horseback throughout the North American backcountry, and encountered many animals, human and non-human. But the sounds I heard that night were not of any animal I had heard before. The Water Tower by John G. This occurrence happened to my friend Colin and myself in about 1959. At the time we were about 13 and still attending Hagley Roman Catholic High School. The time was about 8 or 8:30 in the evening, and the month I no longer remember, but it was in the Northern Hemisphere autumn, winter because it was dark quite early. The local town was Kidderminster in the county of Worcestershire, roughly in the middle of England. The area was Birchen Coppice, a housing estate owned by the local council. It was then a respectable area, as it was only probably 8 years old. I believe the area is now more of a slum, but I haven't been there in 33 years, as we moved in the middle 60s, and then I relocated to Australia in 67. A bit of geography is needed here. The street we lived on was Kinver Ave. The rear of our houses backed onto undeveloped bushland, which went onto some pretty unspoiled countryside in most directions. However, the area just to the rear and to the south was called the Burlish Camp. This camp was built in World War II as a repatriation hospital for U.S. servicemen. After the war, it was used to house Polish war refugees, and as children, we played, mixed, and schooled with their children. In the middle 50s, the people were relocated and the whole area was knocked flat, except for one lonely structure called the Water Tower. As the name suggests it It was just that, a very large brick tower. From childhood memory, maybe 50 by 50 by 80 to 100 feet high, with a giant water tank in the top. It was used to supply the Burlish camp with water, and there were 8 windows, 4 at the rear and 4 at the front. The first pair were about 30 feet off the ground, and the next pair maybe another 30 feet up. There was a steel door on the southern side, but it was bricked up in the middle 50s, and there was never any electricity to it, and it was now inaccessible. Back to my story. Colin and I were just hanging out at the end of our street under a streetlight. This streetlight was at the junction where our tarred street met with a wide dirt track that led over to the Burlish camp, straight past the water tower, and down onto a small town called Stourport-on-Severn, about 4 miles further on. During our conversation, Colin said, "Hey, look at those lights in the water tower." The tower was maybe a quarter of a mile away, but we could make it out in the moonlight. I was quite surprised, because we could see some form of moving or blinking light in the window area of the tower. The color of the light did not appear as normal to what we call light, meaning candles or incandescent light, which always seems to have a warm and yellow content. This light was very sallow white to opaque. A short time later, about 20 yards from us on the dirt track at an angle of about 45 degrees, we could see a light, the same color light that was in the tower. From this point on, in the following events, I have no recollection of time. I remember we thought it was someone on a bicycle because the light seemed to fall to the ground. We started giggling, saying it must be someone drunk and maybe they fell off their bike. In the next instance, I remember myself drawn and staring wide-eyed at the figure of a man, particularly at his face. It was on its side, very distinguishable features, a portrait if you will. A vertical flat forehead, long pointed nose, sunken, very staring eyes. Because my concentration was so intense and right on his face, I didn't seem to observe any body detail, except the lack of normal motion movements. He appeared to be floating along, opaque. We could see right through him. The ground all around us seemed to crackle as if Rice Krispies were being trodden on. I picked up a stone and threw it in his direction, and Colin was pulling at my left arm, screaming at me to not throw it. The stone fell short but in line as it hit the soft grass with a thud, and the man brought up his arm as if to protect his face. My legs went to jelly. I fell to the ground and the vision disappeared, and Colin ran off, holding his ears and screaming as he stumbled, running through people's front gardens. But I vividly recall floating above the streetlight. I can remember details such as the bird droppings on top of the post. I watched Colin pulling my left arm, me throwing the stone, collapsing on the ground, and Colin running away screaming. The next thing I remembered, I was lying on the ground, and a lady, her name was Mrs. Sayers, was bending over me, asking if I was okay and what was all the shouting. I ran home very scared. Colin lost his hearing for 2 days, and we made a pact not to tell for fear of ridicule. Anyhow, as time went by, we told, and we did get laughed at, but I could never see anything funny about it. This occurrence left an indelible mark on me. Some years later, at age 16, I had been out fox hunting with a companion. Peter wasn't a local and was unfamiliar with our area, and we were heading back to my home on a dirt motorcycle at about 2:30 or 3 in the morning. Peter was pillion, and I was riding. We were directly in front of the tower, a few hundred yards away, and Peter shouted to me, "Hey, who lives over there?" I said, "Over where?" as I concentrated on riding with no lights. "Over there, to your left." And as I looked, to my left, of course, it was the water tower. My eyes nearly popped, and my jaw dropped. I was aghast. Each of the windows in the tower had those same lights as years before, but even more startling, we could distinctly see people, like figures, lined up as if waiting to go in where the door used to be. The figures weren't distinguishable separately, but were the same opaque color as the little white man I had seen so many years ago. That little dirt motorbike became the fastest bike in the land. Many years later, talking to my late father, We were passing the time talking about our family, being kids, where we lived, neighbors, and the like. Dad was telling me about the post-war years, 56 to 60, and how times were hard, and 5 or 6 of the local ladies would work continuous night shifts in a manufacturing plant in the above-mentioned town called Starport-on-Severn. He said they would cycle 8 to 10 miles to work each way instead of 3 miles shortcut through the Brolish camp. I said, why would they waste their time with that? And he replied, Mrs. Hawker next door says that none of the women felt good about going that way. It always seemed very still and eerie when they went past the water tower. And when they came home in the morning, the birds were singing, but not up there by the tower. It was always still and quiet. Dad gave off a chuckle, and I didn't. I knew just what they meant. Well, in the mid to late 60s, the tower was to be removed to make way for a communications repeater station. The local news was there to cover the Big Bang, and it took 3 days of drilling and explosives to finally fell the tower. The experts were scratching their heads. They couldn't understand how it had stayed up through so many explosive attempts. I have an idea. Abandoned World War II Fort. There's an abandoned and boarded-up World War II fort in the southern part of Belgium that we used to often sneak into with the scouts. Getting in there requires scaling a sheer wall. We placed anchoring points for ropes and climbing gear, and it was next to a relatively busy road. So you're being super quiet, making no light, and cowering every time a car passes so they don't spot you in their lights. Now the atmosphere is set. The moment you enter it, it's like diving into water. Sound stops and the entire place is at a constant 14 degrees Celsius, with a slight breeze passing through. The tunnel is barely large enough for me, and I'm slightly broader than the average person, and it's hard to pass without turning your body sideways. The tunnel is just high enough to work up a decent gait while hunched over. If someone ahead of you blocks a passage for a moment, the breeze stops, and it feels like the entire tunnel network takes a breath. Because of the way the tunnels are constructed, they echo in a way that your own footsteps seem to be coming from behind you. They also seem to take one more step than you do when you stop. Of course, we don't allow the guys and gals to make any source of light in there, so it's pretty scary overall. One time I was in there, posted at a side passage to ensure everyone took the same path and didn't get lost. I went in first before any of the other climbers arrived, so they didn't know there were friendly faces in there to help them. I was in there for quite a while, just waiting for the first to come by, when I saw a dancing light coming down the long hallway. I quietly settled back in my nook and waited for whoever was smart enough to hide some matches from me, and then I would take them away. The light quietly bobbed closer when I realized there weren't any footsteps accompanying that light. I poked my head around the corner just in time to see it disappear, and still I heard no footsteps. I settled back and waited some more when I realized I did hear some scuffling. Very faint. Breathing noises, but still very faint. I become aware of a wet heat coming from right in front of me with a faint smell of sweat, dirt. Suddenly I realized there was someone there, right in front of me, inches from my face in the dark. The breathing stopped suddenly. Whatever it was aware of me as well. Whatever or whoever it was, we were both holding our breath, both acutely aware of one another. It took ages. I was sitting there, unable to move, speak, or breathe properly. And then the wet heat feeling passed, and some minutes later I became aware of a very faint light coming up from my right side, which soon dissipated and left. Some time later still, I heard the familiar stomping of combat boots coming down the hallway from my left. It was another person. I stopped them, told them to keep following the passageway and take the first right that they come to. Out of curiosity, I asked who was the first one in. He said no one. He was the first. It was explained much later. The first guy got lost down a dead-end side passage, and the second girl passed him by. She got nervous from the footsteps and removed her shoes. She saw me poke my head from around the corner and dropped her match, and then passed me very slowly. One of the checkpoints later said she was crying her eyes out. She had no idea it was there, and was more afraid of me than me of her. Thanks for listening, gang. If you have a story you'd like to hear on this channel, send it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment if you wish. The banter here is fun. And make sure to click on the notifications bell too. That'll let you know when new content is posted. I also have a Patreon page for those of you who would like to receive content early and see some videos that are not available here. For as little as $1 per month, you'll have access. Larger amounts mean more perks. Thanks to all of my new patrons, it's awesome to have you here. And don't forget, follow me on social media too. Links to my Patreon and those are in the description. I'm on vacation for a bit, but we'll be posting, so I hope you dig it. And until next time, be excellent to each other. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.